when 85% of the indigenous Palestinian people were displaced. The ongoing land displacement in that area and the acquisition of lands to the west looked a lot like what happened here to indigenous people in the United States. So essentially, we've heard most recently that President Trump gave a speech at Mount Rushmore. Part of what happens in the 19th century in the United States is that the territories that the United States acquired that belonged to Native Americans under treaty were acquired under the guise of land preservation. And this is essentially the same logic of that wall that keeps on swallowing Palestinian lands. Essentially, Israel calls the project of acquiring more of these lands that belong to Palestinians now. It's under the Nature and Parks Authority. And this Nature and Parks Authority routinely confiscates lands tilled by Palestinians. And essentially it gives them notice of intent to acquire these lands for public purposes. And the ongoing construction of the 280-mile apartheid wall in the West Bank is strategically designed to seize Palestinian residential and agricultural lands in its path. Again, under the guise of building parks. This was the strategy, in fact, used by the United States to acquire and displace and justify the acquisition of Native American lands under the law known as the Homestead Act of 1852, which essentially gave land grants to settler farmers, Europeans, but also the railroads. What we also see happening, because ultimately land acquisition is foundational to the settler colonial project and it must continuously expand, the modern rendition of that is gentrification. And what we saw in Palestine was a project of gentrification in port cities like Jaffa, which is the oldest port city in the world. The gentrification projects of Palestinian lands there looked exactly like gentrification projects in style, aesthetic, and character to the ones in Brooklyn and the South Bronx, and now Flushing, Queens. So land acquisition is critical, and if you're going to acquire land, people are going to fight back from the beginning to now. What is fascinating about the control of the settler colonial project is that it needs to render an ideology that justifies its mission. So what happens both in the United States and in Israel is that the resistance of those who've been colonized and displaced is identified as terrorism. And the actions of the colonizer that deploys structural terror is known as security. So this is the language that defines the ways in which the state interfaces with the displaced, the racialized, and the oppressed. They are the terrorists, and we are the people who uphold law and order and security. And it's this logic that justifies the rampant, wholesale, mass genocide in the streets by police, both in the United States and in Israel. Unless you think that this term, terrorism, is one that emerges with Israel. In fact, the term called, it's counterinsurgency. The term counterinsurgency doesn't emerge in the 20th century. It actually emerges with the need of the emerging American state to continuously kill the Native American people. In the 1600s, the term that I'm looking for that you might help me out with, it's one that is connected to savage war, the policy of savage war, which is that if we're going to take over people's lands, we're going to have to perpetually fight those people because they're going to fight back. So we're going to have to target civilians, women, and children. And to do that, we have to organize the population because this is required to consolidate the state. Counterinsurgency, low-intensity war, which is used in Israel. And apparently Israel is now training American police in counterinsurgency and low-intensity war. Well, that is the logic and language and policy that developed in the early colonies here in the United States to keep down the Native American people. I know that I'm probably running out of time, but the problem with Israel and the Palestinians is that Palestinians are not integral to the Israeli economy. Palestinians outside of 48 constitute 2% of the labor force, much like Native Americans here. Native Americans are not at all integral to the economy of the United States. That's why they were able to be warehoused in reservations. And that's why there's an ongoing project of genocide. African Americans, however, are different. They were integral to the project of capitalism because they produced the second wealthiest society humanity had ever seen, second only to the British Empire, the 4 million slaves in the South, upon which capitalism was built, and they later eventually became part of the working class. The Native American example is the one that most approximates that of Palestinians. And this is why there are open air prisons in Gaza and the West Bank, because it's a population that in fact needs to be eviscerated because its growing demographic threatens the existence of Israel, much like the potentially growing demographic of Native Americans in the Western territories threatened the existence of the United States. That's why they had to be eviscerated, Native Americans, completely, and put in reservations. The other major issue that we see in the settler colonial project is the evisceration of culture, language, and history. Why? Because this brings people together and gives them a sense of their power and offers the possibility for resistance. So what the settler colonial project does is that it erases those people. When we were in 48 in Israel, we learned that the term Palestinian in the schools in 48 does not exist. The words used to describe Palestinians is Arab persons or other people. So this is critical. This evisceration and dehumanization is critical to the project. In Puerto Rico, a colonized country by the United States, the language that was the official language when the United States colonized it was English. That was imposed on schools. But also, you want to curb cultural practices. So the Puerto Rican flag was made illegal in Puerto Rico in 1947. And Puerto Ricans couldn't sing songs that identified them with a liberation struggle, much like when we were there in in 48, Israel had just declared that Palestinian taxi drivers could not play Palestinian songs in East Jerusalem. So this is another critical component. The other component, of course, is the dehumanization and finally criminalization. Like the United States, Palestine is one of the greatest incarcerators. It's essentially prison nation, the greatest prison nation of the world. 1 in 5 Palestinian people have been imprisoned by the Israeli state. In the United States, we see the same situation. We represent 5% of the world's population, but have 25% of the world's prisoners. In this context, the oppressor, given its blatant attempt at controlling the population, has to ideologically gain credence around the world. So Israel touts itself as a nation of laws. America calls itself the land of the free. That incarceration that is integral to both these projects is about controlling those populations and ensuring that the displaced are not ever going to fight back. Alongside incarceration, you have a mass imprisonment of political prisoners. So since 1967, Israel has imprisoned 800,000 political prisoners. In the United States, we see a similar process happening. There are dozens, many of whom have been imprisoned, dozens of formerly colonized people who were fighting back in the 60s, Puerto Ricans, Native Americans, Black Americans, even Asians, who were imprisoned in the 60s and given harsh sentences for for breaking the commandments of this country, which is that they were standing their ground and fighting empire and sending a message for others to follow. So I'm going to conclude my remarks there and say that we can't really understand policing and its racialized character and genocidal character if we do not understand the ways in which the settler colonial project doesn't only rely on the state to contain the populations whose lands it must usurp. It also has to rely upon its citizens to do that job. And these states, therefore, because Israeli supremacy or Zionist supremacy or white supremacy here is integral to their DNA, even as they built their societies and their citizens, that logic is on fleek when the state is afforded the job of eliminating people. These states cannot be reformed. They have to be brought down. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Before I turn to Maha, the last speaker, I just want to remind everyone to post their questions on the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to them in a little bit. Maha, you have the floor.
All right. Thank you, Nadia, and to Laura and all the organizers for today's panel. I'm coming to you today from Tucson, Arizona, the site of stolen lands of the Kanaaka Nation and the Pasquayaki tribe. My co-panelists have talked in very great detail and really sort of powerfully about the structures of settler colonialism and racialization in the United States and Israel, and particularly the historical context that informed those structures. So I wanted to spend my time today talking a little bit more about current conditions, and in particular how they affect, more specifically, Palestinians from 48, also known as Palestinian citizens of Israel, and then also draw some parallels and think about where we are now and maybe start opening the conversation about where we can go in the future. So to begin with, I want to start with a story that happened almost exactly 1 year ago. So on July 5th, 2019, a woman by the name of Du'a Saadi, who's a 48 Palestinian resident in Lid, she went to the Ramat Ashkol neighborhood in Lid to pick up her friend and her friend's daughter from preschool in her car. Du'a noticed an unmarked car was following her and started to feel afraid. She parked the car to wait for her friend, and then here's how she described what happened next. She says, quote, "Two plain-clothed men got out of their car and came over and told me they were from the police. They accused me of parking illegally and started screaming at me and tried to arrest me. I asked them for a female officer to be present. After a bit, the policeman came back without a policewoman, and the situation devolved from there, to the point that I started to be hit by them. So I started to scream and to cry. They broke my hand, pulled off my hijab off my head, and smashed a necklace that was around my neck." Unquote. Du'a was handcuffed, she was arrested, and she was taken to the local police station. She was held there and interrogated for over 4 hours. She was released without getting a parking ticket, though they did add a new charge that she allegedly hit one of the officers. Du'a asked them to transfer her to the hospital, which they refused to do. Upon her release, she immediately went to the hospital to get treatment for her broken hand. Now, a witness had filmed this police assault on Du'a, though the witness didn't come anywhere near the police or try to intervene, fearing for their own safety. The footage was subsequently circulated on social media, leading to outrage among 48 Palestinians. A few days later, on July 10th, 2019, a protest was held outside the court, and the protesters were denouncing police brutality. One of those protest leaders, a woman by the name of Fida Shahada, is a member of the Lid municipality, and she told reporters, quote, "The protest came after the assault on Du'a, but every day we see and hear about another attack and about another incident of racist treatment by the police against Arab citizens," unquote. So I wanted to start with this story because I think it points all too well to many of the analogies that have been brought up already here, and also to bring it back down to the ground where it actually affects people, particularly this particular case of Du'a Saadi, but also we can think about all of the people who heard of the incident, all of the people who witnessed it on social media, all the people who came out in protest, and all the people who denounced it. I think it's also very telling the fact that I came across this on social media that because it was being circulated by 48 Palestinians. And it was only circulating in the Arabic news media and on Arabic Facebook. There was no awareness of it, as far as I could tell, in the United States. I wrote about it a bit last year, but it didn't really pick up much traction. And so one of the things that I want to think about is that even as we're analyzing these parallel structures of settler colonialism, police violence, and state racism, I think it's also important that we also keep in mind that the victims themselves also circulate globally and are very intertwined as well. I want to also think about it in terms of the use of police violence and the parallels between them. The story that I just said, with a few changes to names and dates and locations, could very easily be a story that comes out of the United States. The use of police violence with impunity, the lack of accountability, the adding on of charges, and really just the disregard for the humanity of the victim, the racial profiling and the surveillance, the presumption of guilt, police following her around, the suspicion around her because she seemed to be, quote unquote, in the wrong neighborhood. These are all part of larger structures of police surveillance and of state surveillance, and I'll come back to the idea of surveillance in a little bit. I think this story also reminds us of the larger structures of systemic and racialized oppression that my panelists have already discussed. So far beyond looking at Du'a's specific story, we can also understand all the various and myriad ways in which 48 Palestinians are disproportionately targeted and also often disproportionately neglected by the state, which leads to socioeconomic disparities that then translate into social ills that are then used to justify racist views of Palestinians as culturally inferior, prone to violence and other nefarious activities, and therefore undeserving of the extension of basic civil and human rights. To talk just a little bit about what some of these socioeconomic disparities and structural inequities are, and how they manifest in our current reality. We've already heard about the ways in which Israeli settler colonialism and state racism has led to economic disparities and structural disparities in terms of excluding Palestinians from the workforce, etc. And so what that means is that today, 1948 Palestinians are concentrated in blue-collar jobs, even when they have higher levels of education. They're more likely to be laid off first in the case of an economic downturn. And there's also a great deal of underdevelopment in the Palestinian sector through the confiscation of land, in particular, which not only impedes agricultural development, but also deprives Palestinians of land that could be developed for non-agricultural uses, in terms of businesses, manufacturing, etc. Palestinian municipalities are also excluded from high-priority areas, also known as development zones. Those development zones are often granted subsidies and tax breaks or given favorable grants and loans by the government. Now notice I'm talking about the Palestinian sector and Palestinian municipalities, and that's because housing municipalities are largely segregated in Israel. There are a few so-called mixed towns, but for the most part, we have a separate and unequal system inside the Green Line, inside what's known as Israel today. That separate and unequal structure also extends to schooling. The schools are largely segregated as well. We have what they call Arab schools and Hebrew schools based on the primary language of instruction. Most Palestinian students are concentrated in those so-called Arab schools, which are under-resourced. Arab students are allocated on average 75% of the budget that's allocated to Jewish students. This underfunding results in large class sizes, poor infrastructure and facilities, shortage of classrooms. It also leads to higher school dropout rates and lower university admission test scores, particularly in those poorer communities, which then reinforce the cycle of unemployment and concentrated labor at the lower rungs of the economy. This disinvestment in Palestinian sectors, as well as the lack of resources and employment opportunities, unsurprisingly, leads to higher crime rates with an influx of drugs, guns, and gangs into Palestinian communities. This year in particular, 2020, has seen a frightening rise in homicide rates among 48 Palestinians, only a fraction of which are investigated. So all of this ties into larger cultural dynamics as well. Professor Fernandez talked about the elimination of the native, the evisceration of their identity, and we very much see this in terms of 48 Palestinians as well. Israeli school children are constantly given a message that Arabs are inherently violent, that they don't have a culture or a society that's worth taking pride in. And even Arab students, Palestinian students in those